Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to episode 2 of Keeping Water. At the end of episode 1, we left the history of my pond just as 2018 was starting. Winter in early 2018 was savage, with a particular cold snap dubbed the Beast from the East, seeing heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures for an extended period. Initially, my pond coped well with the extreme conditions. Although one side had a patch of ice, it was thin, and the flow from the filter to the pond and from the waterfall kept a good part of the surface clear of ice. Although the patch of ice was growing, it was slow, and the forecast suggested an improvement on the way, so I wasn't too concerned. However, one Sunday morning I checked on the pond later than usual. The water was at half depth, and the surface appeared completely frozen over. On closer inspection, the water was only about 18 inches deep, most of which was frozen. All of the fish I could see, the carp and larger rudd, were obviously dead. What water was left in the multi-bay was also frozen. It appears that water in one of the exposed pipes froze, a joint then failed, as the pressure from the still working pump increased, and water was pumped out of the pond. With no flow going into the filter or coming from it to agitate the pond surface, and with the water becoming shallower and shallower in the pond and filter, both froze completely. The fish had nowhere to go to escape the ice and died. In all honesty, I was surprised how much this affected me. Made worse, I think, as they were my son's fish, and I really couldn't face doing anything to the pond. Additionally, it started snowing again, or this was actually the precursor to a thaw, and after a further week or so the water got to a stage that I could remove the dead fish. I then began searching the pond with a net, and after more frogs than I can mention, and a few dead rudd fry, I lifted up the net to find a live wriggling baby rudd. I quickly filled a bucket with pond water to place it in. More netting found more fry, both dead and alive. Of the 30 or so fry I had, 14 had survived, and, spoiler alert, I still have them and they're all doing well. I then realised I had not seen the then 10-inch tench. Grown more optimistic that she'd survived, I searched around with the net for another 10 minutes, when I finally recovered a sluggish but alive fish. I then had to find somewhere to put them. Fortunately, I had a 4-foot plastic pond in the garage. I filled it with some pond water and some fresh, added an aquarium filter and some bags of K1 from the multi-bay. I put the fish in it and then covered it with a net. With the surviving fish made safe, I had to sit down and plan what to do next. I had 3 options. 1. Sell the fish and equipment and fill the pond in. 2. Tidy up the pond, but otherwise leave it as it was and return the fish when complete. 3. Keep the fish in the garage and rebuild the pond. 1 was actually something I seriously considered. If there hadn't been any surviving fish, it may have been the option I chose. 2 seemed tempting, but there were issues with the pond that needed fixing, and I had to address the dangerous weaknesses in inclement weather. The most tempting, but A, I had a budget, B, did I have the knowledge to fix it, and C, did I have the skills? In what may seem an unsurprising move now, but at the time was by no means a foregone conclusion, I decided on option 3. I then had to work out how to fix the many problems the pond had and decide on any less essential but still desirable changes I wanted to make. The problems were as follows. 1. The pond wasn't level. My garden slopes downwards from the back to the front. I didn't take this into account at all when first digging the pond, and only really noticed its full effect when I first filled it with water. See episode 1. There was about 6-inch difference from the highest to the lowest. It not only reduced the potential depth of the pond, but also spoilt its look. 2. The exposed pipework and filter were fragile in cold weather. The effect of the winter freeze was far more serious due to how much of the pipework and the filter itself were exposed to the elements. 3. The marginal plants routinely fell over in moderate to strong winds. As well as the whole pond not being level, the marginal shelves were also not level, with sections lower at the front, meaning the plants' baskets would often fall over. 4. Autumnal leaves. As I mentioned in episode 1, an oak tree very close to my garden drops thousands of leaves every autumn around and into the pond. Even with a netted cage, it's a labour-intensive nightmare for a couple of months each year. 5. Water loss, waterfall leaking. The pond lost about an inch of depth every 2 weeks. I checked the liner as much as I could and couldn't find any obvious leak, and checked the waterfall, which did appear to have damp soil around it. So, the solutions I decided upon were as follows. 1. Replace the old liner and remove the waterfall. This was to address the leak by removing the 2 possible sources. I would also need a new liner due to solution number 2. 2. Dig away the 3rd level, increase the overall depth and level the pond and marginal shelves. The aim of this is to enable a more consistent and neater look to the pond, prevent plants from falling and help to increase the water volume and amount of deeper water for any larger fish. 3. Build a shed for the filter. A filter shed will not only protect the filtration from the elements, but also me whilst I clean it. It would also enable storage for other pond equipment. 4. Build a walled raised area between pond and shed. The main aim of this would be to bury and protect the pipework to and from the filter from the elements. It would also enable planting, some of which would grow into the water to add to the look of the pond. 5. Add a skimmer. This would mainly be to help with the leaves, but also with other surface detritus. With plans made, minus the skimmer, funds didn't allow, so it would have to wait a year. The first step in the rebuild was to take everything out of the pond, starting with the plants. I wanted to keep them all, so I stored them in a pool, which was obviously a dog pool. With the kitten's supervision and kind of help, I then removed the waterfall. I next removed the filtration and then began pumping out the remaining water, which had to go from the pond, through the conservatory, through the garage and out to the drain at the front of the house. Time then to remove the liner and underlay. I could then begin digging, but I could once I'd pumped the rainwater out. The first stage was to remove the 3rd level. This took ages and was back-breaking, and I was very pleased when it was finished. Worth it though, as it would significantly increase the water volume and provide more areas of deeper water for the fish. The next stage was to cut away the marginal shelf roughly to match the length of the proposed shed, about here. I could then build a rustic, meaning messy, walled planted area between the shed and the pond. This was actually going to be quite difficult to dig, the heavy clay plus the need to follow the existing wall shape while cutting it away at the right angle, tested by an already dodgy back. Again, worth it when complete. The 3rd stage was to level the pond. The method I chose to achieve this was to use a laser level and a camera tripod. This, admittedly hokey technique, involved using the level to find the lowest edge of the pond, and then, after ensuring the tripod was level, rotating the laser around the pond, cutting back the edging to match the lowest level. This was clearly imperfect, but it worked to a point. Instead of a 6-inch variance, I improved it to under an inch, which I was happy with. The next section I had to dig was to clear a flat level area for the shed. I cleared most of the raised area that I'd created for the waterfall and made sure the ground was flat and at the same height as the newly levelled pond. With excellent timing, the shed arrived. I made a base frame which I levelled and secured with ground spikes and protected with a waterproof membrane. With my son's help, I then constructed the shed. It was pretty straightforward and went up in a couple of hours. Over the next few days I added 3 coats of wood preserve. With the shed finished, I began installing the filtration and electrics. I positioned the multi-bay, then moved the switch box into the shed, attached it onto a board, and also added a shelf for the air pumps. I added a socket to the switch box to ease the use of temporary items, e.g. a pond vacuum. I added a board below the window and attached the UV to it, and then began plumbing in the filtration and tidied up the cables. Time, unfortunately, to return to digging, but these would be the final stages. First I dug the left half of the pond deeper with a slope drop from the right side. I also tried to contour the sides. I then levelled the marginal shelf, ensuring that it also sloped a little backwards to prevent plants from falling over. I also used wet clay to repair the edges of the pond. It had been hot and dry and the earth was starting to crumble. With that finished, I could obviously add underlay and a new liner, except the weather had other ideas and supplied me with some water a day early. One last pump out. With the water cleared out, I could lay the liner and begin filling up. An exciting time, but tricky, as I'm particularly bad at reducing the folds in the liner. It's always a good excuse for getting in the pond though. With the pond nearly full and looking satisfyingly close to level, it was time to return the plants to the pond. They appear to have done well in the dog pool, showing some healthy growth. Now to finish off the filtration. I took the outlet end section I'd made earlier and connected it to the pipework from the filter. I also put the pump back into the pond and connected that into the filter house. The plan was to hide or protect this pipework with a walled plant area, but I wanted to leave it running for a few days to test for leaks before I covered it in the final positions. After a few days running and with no leaks, I lowered the water level and built the rustic wall between the pond and filter shed. I'd not built a wall of any kind before, and the rocks I used, which were the only ones I had, were uneven and devoid of flat edges. I didn't film or photograph this process, I had no confidence in what I was doing. It actually went okay, and once finished I backfilled it with topsoil. After a couple of days I bought some plants and added them to the walled area. All this work was completed while in the pond, thank goodness for hot weather and warm water. A week later it was time to return the surviving fish to the pond. All the fish appeared healthy and none the worse for their stay in the garage, and for a short while they had the pond to themselves. Before any new fish arrived though, autumn would be here, and my friendly neighbourhood oak tree had several thousand gifts for me. I decided to add an even finer netting, which did a slightly better job, although leaves were still magically drawn to the water, or so it seemed. As soon as I had decided to rebuild the pond, I had also decided what fish I wanted in it. In addition to the tench and rudd I already had, I wanted to add 2 carp and at least 1 more tench. Sourcing carp would prove surprisingly difficult. Most mirror common carp available were quite small, and I was keen to buy fish similar to the size of the ones I had lost. The solution was to move away from pondfish suppliers and contact fishery suppliers instead, who would have larger and arguably better quality fish. I therefore approached VS Fisheries and explained what I was after and asked whether they could supply small numbers, as they usually provide fish to fishing lakes in the hundreds. Luckily they could, but explained that they didn't deliver fish until October or November. Although this is later in the year than fish are usually stocked in garden ponds, I agreed and placed my order. November arrived, and so did the fish. On arrival I filled a small 4-foot rescue pond with some pond water and floated the fish in the bag for about 20 minutes. I then removed each of them and placed them in the small pond. They were a little beat up, missing scales and had some split fins, but otherwise okay. I inspected them for any other issues before releasing them into the main pond. Not having a large enough separate system, I had no space to quarantine them. Into 2019, and in January another delivery of fish arrived. Again, not the best time to add stock to the pond, but it went well. This time a pair of tench, one male, one female, both about half the size of the female tench I already had. In February the forecast was for more low temperatures and snow. I decided to add a couple of extras just to be sure, which included a tarpaulin over the leaf netting frame to keep the snow and wind chill off the water, and a thermal cover over the filter. Winter fortunately passed well with no problems, and into spring I started to address some of the outstanding improvements I had planned. The first was replace the air stones with a disc. This definitely improved the movement of the fluidised media. I do find the bubbling media slightly hypnotic, but that may just be me. Everything appeared to be going well, until I began hearing regular splashing from the pond. I set up my phone to video and captured the following. On netting the fish there were no obvious signs of infection or damage, so I suspected parasites. This is where I made another beginner's mistake, and instead of getting a scrape and identifying which particular parasite it was, I treated with a general anti-parasite treatment. This is really not recommended, and I was very fortunate that it worked and that the fish have not had any problems since. Into the summer, and the fish were feeding well and growing fast. All of the lost scales and split fins they'd had when delivered to me had healed. There had been no more incidents of jumping or flashing, and they all looked in great condition. The next outstanding job I had was to install a skimmer. This would have been easier to fit last year during the rebuild, but the budget at the time didn't allow it. The skimmer I chose was an Oasis Biosys. It came with a fake rock cover and appeared straightforward, in terms of function, if not cost. I was quite concerned about fitting it, not only due to my dodgy DIY skills, but also because I finally had a level, non-leaking pond, and I didn't want to ruin it. However, autumn was fast approaching, so I got to work, by first draining the pond below the height that the base of the skimmer would sit at. I then dug the hole for the skimmer, trying my best to make it level, but you know my history with that. I then attached the faceplate to the skimmer, trapping the liner in between, and then cut a hole in the liner, with my fingers very crossed, although all looked good so far. Next it was a case of digging a trench to take the power cable to the shed and the pipework from the skimmer back to the pond. I threaded the cable through PVC pipes, both as protection but also to make changing the pump easier in the future. I just temporarily fixed the return. I wanted to experiment with the angle and height to get the best result before making it more permanent. That could wait until spring. With the trench filled in and the wood chip replaced, it didn't look too bad. The skimmer worked pretty well and fought valiantly against the autumn leaves. Unfortunately, as you'll see, there were slightly more leaves than one small skimmer could deal with. I didn't use the netting this autumn and relied on a combination of manual labour and the skimmer to deal with the leaves. It wasn't too bad. And that brings us to the end of the history of my pond. We're pretty much up to date now. Thank you so much if you got this far and stuck with my story. In episode 3 of Keeping Water, I'll show you what the pond is like today in 2020. I'll share some facts and figures, have a closer look at the individual fish, and show you the small changes I've made this year. If you've enjoyed this video, or at least can see some promise, I would be delighted if you could give it a like. And if you'd like to see more videos, I'm aiming to release one every Saturday, please subscribe. Many thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.